to ask Mr. Lyons, do you believe that ICE has the authority to be deployed to U.S. polling places around the country?
So, ma'am, we're a civil, obviously, we do civil enforcement and criminal law enforcement. There's no reason for us to deploy to a polling facility.
So if the President of the United States gets Kristi Noem on the phone and she gets you on the phone and she says, we've heard there's a problem in Georgia or in Michigan or somewhere else, I need you to go and physically deploy around polling locations, you will say no.
There's no reason for us to deploy, ma'am.
Then you should say.
This may look like a routine exchange about agency policy, but it's actually a stress test of executive power. What's really being tested here is whether federal law enforcement would act as a neutral institution or as an instrument of political authority during an election cycle. This raises broader questions about how far presidential influence can extend into state-controlled voting systems. In this video, we'll break down the constitutional stakes behind this confrontation and why the answer given under oath matters far beyond this hearing room.
Senator Slotkin.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I personally think that Secretary Noem should be here. You want the big job. You have the big accountability. And we should be seeing the Secretary of Homeland Security coming in front of the American people and certainly the Oversight Committee when we have such existential issues about the deployment of federal force in our country going on. But you are here in her place. And I think, you know, if we rewound the tape to a year and a half ago or a year plus ago, you had a lot of Americans who felt very strongly that if you are here illegally, especially if you were involved in any kind of criminal activity, you should be deported, right? You need strong borders. I'm a CIA officer. You need strong borders. We need an immigration policy that allows us to do that. But that enforcement would have been something that the average American supported. But the conduct of ICE in places like Minneapolis has now boomeranged to the point where people say, well, look, I was for enforcement, but I'm not for what looks like authoritarian style, federal goons on our streets. And that's not coming from Democrats. That's coming from, in Michigan, the state of Michigan voted for Donald Trump. You're just coming from people who say, look, I'm all for enforcement, but I'm not for trampling basic rights. And Americans have an internal barometer for what looks and smells authoritarian. And whether it's shooting someone who's unarmed or pepper spraying kids or picking people up as they walk into Target and checking their papers, that is an internal barometer that we all have. That you have crossed. And we're here today and all this firestorm is here, not because of people on the ground, but because of your behavior in ICE. And, I think when you extrapolate out and you listen to what the president and his cabinet are saying, I have to ask about our 2026 elections. Okay? The president says we should federalize our elections, even though the U.S. Constitution was written by our founders to give that power to the states so that we would never have a president who took too much power and tried to become a king. He's tried to get voter rolls, including in my state. He's complained that elections aren't free and fair. In 2020, he came up with a playbook to deploy federal law enforcement around polling places, and the White House spokeswoman will not rule that out as of a month and a half ago. So I have to ask Mr. Lyons, do you believe that ICE has the authority to be deployed to U.S. polling places around the country?
So, ma'am, we're a civil, obviously, we do civil enforcement and criminal law enforcement. There's no reason for us to deploy to a polling facility.
So if the President of the United States gets Kristi Noem on the phone and she gets you on the phone and she says, we've heard there's a problem in Georgia or in Michigan or somewhere else, I need you to go and physically deploy around polling locations, you will say no.
There's no reason for us to deploy, ma'am.
Then you should say no, right?
Yes, but just point of clarification. Homeland Security investigations, we do investigate voter fraud, which we've made several arrests, most recently a high-profile one in Massachusetts. So just later on.
That's very different than the physical intimidation.
I just didn't want you to say that we don't do anything with voter. I just want you to know we do that.
That's fine. I'm talking about something that I think would be extraordinary in American history, which is uniformed and masked ICE agents encircling polling places. And it's not fantasy. It's not made up. These are things that the president and his cabinet have suggested. They've suggested invoking the Insurrection Act, which would allow active duty military to do the very same thing. So this isn't, someone who thinks the sky is falling. The president and his cabinet are suggesting. So you're going to be the guy standing in the breach
There's no reason, like I said, ma'am, there's no reason for you to use ICE officers in that.
Great. Well, I hope that in the privacy of that meeting, when that comes down and the president feels like he's going to lose the midterm elections, that you don't buckle. Because I think our democracy literally is dependent on it. Now, coupled with that, you've heard from a number of my colleagues about labeling people as domestic terrorists. What is the definition of a domestic terrorist?
So, ma'am, domestic terrorist is any organization that, on American soil, on home nation soil, that's involved in acts of treason, acts of violence, active extremism against a group or against a country.
Okay, so actually in law, it's defined by the Patriot Act. That's the clearest place we have it. And it has to be tied to criminal activity, right?
Okay.
So protesting, even if you don't like it, protesting of ICE agents, unarmed and without destroying property, is that a domestic terrorist?
No, ma'am. I stated under oath earlier that that's covered on the First Amendment right.
Great. So when, again, the president and Stephen Miller and others in the cabinet, including your boss, Kristi Noem, label people like Renee Good domestic terrorists, you understand why we can't trust what you're doing with the information you're collecting on these so-called domestic terrorists. So can you tell us under oath, does the Department of Homeland Security maintain a database of any kind of domestic terrorists? Are you collecting facial recognition information, license plates, locations, addresses, those kinds of information?
No, ma'am, and I testified under oath on Tuesday as well. I said the same thing. We don't have a database. If there is a case, a criminal case, that may involve some type of domestic terrorist organization, Homeland Security, as you know, Homeland Security investigation is involved across the board and embedded with the Joint Terrorism Task Force. We do conduct those, but there is no database, ma'am, for that.
Okay, or do you contribute data to anyone else's, any other federal agency's database?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so the fact that we have ICE agents saying out loud to people that they're trying to arrest or engage with that we're going to put you into a database is just erroneous. They're making that up.
Yes, ma'am, I can't speak to why that officer said it, but we do not do that.
Well, I would just offer that given that the president put out an executive order in September and said he wants a list of domestic terrorist groups to use the full weight of the federal government to go against, you can imagine that people who are peaceful protesters feel like they are going to be targeted and feel that they are at risk. So I think the conduct of your agency has put us in a position where the average American doesn't know whether to trust law enforcement, and that is terrible and scary, given what law enforcement on the ground in our states do. And I would just say, if we do not have serious reform and change, then you will be contributing to the average American who woke up very supportive of law enforcement, being terrified that they and their community will be next. Yield back.
Thank you. We're almost at an end, and I think we've had a good hearing. I think a lot of knowledge came forward, and I sense at least the idea that you guys want to restore confidence in the agencies, and we'll work on that, and I hope that's true. With regard to the thing I mentioned before, I'm going to mention one more time as we end. The Attorney General says he will cooperate with final orders. You got a bunch of final orders. I would love to see you go for some specific people that you send a letter to the Minneapolis police and say, will you help us? We need 10 policemen to go round up this guy. And then I'd like to see their response. And you should quote him from the hearing. He said he's for final orders. I think that's different than the policy he's been enforcing. So let's challenge him on that. Those are battles you can win. Those are political battles and public relations battles. Also, if you would send to my office specific times when you've been turned down. You've asked for requests. Everybody says they're not helping. I want to know that you're asking and being turned down. That should be publicized, and we're happy to publicize that. I think there are problems on both sides of the equation here, but the way we make them better is by making sure everybody knows about these things. But I do appreciate your cooperation in coming. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. The record for this hearing will remain open until 5 p.m. on Friday, February 13th, 2026 for the submission of statements and questions for the record.
In the final minutes of this hearing, Senator Elissa Slotkin posed a question that cut straight to the foundation of American democracy. It was not about paperwork. It was not about policy nuance. It was about power and restraint. She looked at the acting ICE director and asked plainly, if the President of the United States were to request that immigration agents be physically deployed around polling places, would you say no? That question did not come from nowhere. It followed a series of pointed concerns about federal force on city streets, about masked agents conducting operations in broad daylight, about Americans who once supported enforcement now feeling uneasy about how that enforcement looks and feels in their communities. Slotkin made clear that strong borders and lawful immigration policy are not controversial ideas. But she argued that the conduct of enforcement, the optics, the methods, the tone, has shifted the public mood. And then she expanded the frame. She invoked the Constitution. She reminded the chamber that elections were deliberately entrusted to the states to prevent the concentration of too much authority in a single executive. She referenced past discussions about federal law enforcement presence near polling sites. She mentioned public statements suggesting the possibility of invoking extraordinary powers. And she asked the question that lingers in the background of modern politics. When institutional guardrails are tested, who stands in the breach? The acting director responded that there was no reason for ICE to deploy to polling facilities. He stated that ICE conducts civil and criminal enforcement. He acknowledged investigations into voter fraud under Homeland Security investigations. But when pressed on the specific image, uniformed masked agents encircling voting locations, he said there was no reason for that to occur. It was a moment of clarification, but also a moment of tension, because this exchange was not merely about ICE. It was about the boundaries between federal power and democratic process. It was about whether enforcement agencies designed to uphold the law can remain clearly separate from the mechanics of elections themselves. Slotkin then turned to another volatile term circulating in political discourse: domestic terrorist. She pressed for a legal definition. She referenced the Patriot Act. She distinguished between criminal activity and peaceful protest protected under the First Amendment. And she asked whether the Department of Homeland Security maintains any database labeling individuals as such, whether data is collected, shared, stored. The acting director testified under oath that no such database exists within ICE. He stated that while investigations may involve joint task forces when criminal cases arise, there is no centralized registry of protesters. When Slotkin raised reports of agents allegedly threatening individuals with being put into a database, he responded that such statements would be erroneous. This back and forth revealed something deeper than disagreement. It exposed a widening trust gap. Slotkin argued that rhetoric from the executive branch calls for lists, references to deploying federal force, labeling opponents with severe terminology, creates anxiety among citizens who are exercising their constitutional rights. She suggested that even if internal policies do not reflect those fears, perception alone can erode confidence. And that may be the most sobering theme of the hearing. Law enforcement operates on legitimacy. Its authority does not rest solely on statute books, but on public trust. When Americans begin to question whether federal agents might appear at polling locations, when they worry about being labeled for peaceful protest, when they cannot distinguish between lawful enforcement and intimidation, something fundamental is at stake. At the same time, the acting director emphasized cooperation, denied the existence of sweeping databases, and affirmed that peaceful protest is protected. The chairman closed by calling for transparency, asking for documented instances of cooperation or refusal from local authorities, suggesting that publicizing facts could help restore confidence. Confidence. That word echoed through the chamber. Because this hearing was not simply a clash of ideologies, it was a test of institutional clarity. It asked whether agencies created to enforce immigration law can remain visibly separate from electoral politics. It asked whether leaders will draw firm lines when extraordinary suggestions arise. It asked whether rhetoric will be matched by restraint. Democracy is rarely undone in dramatic gestures. More often, it is strained by ambiguity, by blurred roles, by unclear limits, by the slow erosion of trust between citizens and the institutions meant to serve them. In that exchange, Senator Slotkin framed a hypothetical future. The acting director responded with a present denial. Between those two positions lies the fragile architecture of constitutional governance: checks and balances, federalism, the separation of powers. The American system depends not only on what leaders can do, but on what they refuse to do. It depends on officials who understand the difference between enforcement and intimidation, between investigation and interference, between authority and overreach. This hearing will fade from headlines. The sound bites will circulate. Supporters and critics will draw their conclusions. But the underlying question remains. When power is requested at the edge of its authority, who stands firm? That is not a partisan question. It is a civic one. The health of a republic is measured by the strength of its institutions and the courage of the individuals entrusted to uphold them. We will continue to follow these moments. We will continue to examine the tension between policy and principle. And we will continue to ask whether the system designed to protect liberty is being tested or reinforced. If you believe oversight matters, if you believe transparency matters, if you believe the lines between enforcement and democracy must remain clear. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA. Support our work to expose the truth, expose the